All right, let's watch. Is the U.S. headed towards
100%.
fascism by a second thought?
So it was Easter recently. At time of writing, at least. These videos take a while to make. Cut me some slack. Anyway, what do you think of when you hear the word Easter? Springtime, Easter bunny, candy, resurrection of Jesus for our Christian comrades, and of course, these little guys. I have great memories of Easter egg hunts with my family, and now that I have a young daughter of my own, I'm excited to give her the same experience. So imagine my surprise when we go to the neighborhood playground on Easter, and there are a handful of adults.
What are your thoughts on this guy being a tanky? He literally looks more and more like Vladimir Ilyich Lenin every day, and I love him for it.
Trying to keep kids from picking up a bunch of eggs. Seemed a little weird. So I asked one of them what was going on, and they said, better not to look inside. So naturally, I had to look inside. Here's what I found. Even for someone who keeps tabs on these freaks for a living, this was a little shocking.
I feel like, dude, every day I see this kind of shit, I'm like, the Patriot Front is a fed up. There's no way. They're so comical in the way that they operate. It feels like it's like out of the imaginations of a federal agent.
We live in a quiet suburb. There's never any trouble. And yet here we were, standing somewhere designed for children to play, picking up Easter eggs with fascist rhetoric inside. And if you think about it, this one little Easter egg is indicative of the whole fascist undercurrent in the US. Let's unpack what's going on here. I think we should start with a quick rundown of the Proud Boys and the other fascist groups in the US. The Proud Boys are an exclusively male hate group operating in the US and Canada. These losers are big proponents of the white genocide myth, the idea that white people, a designation that seems to fluctuate whenever convenient, are being replaced by encroaching hordes of nebulously ethnic babies. Besides the Proud Boys, we've got the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, Patriot Front, and Patriot Prayer.
To be honest, I take issue with the people thinking the organized radical right are feds. It implies that there aren't actually people that are that insane. Ironically, most of the people on the right who claim they're feds simultaneously 100% share their views. No, absolutely. There's definitely a lot of organizing happening on the right-wing front, for sure. But I do think that ultimately, the group is like probably half federal agents and half actual fascists. The irony is, of course, that the federal agents also share the fascist opinions half the time.
Finally, the youngest org on the list, Patriot Front. This is another small organization, but I bet you've heard more about them than some of the others. Where the rest play coy and beat around the bush, these guys are explicit in their fascism. They've even got the fascies as part of their logo. If I had to guess which group would end up being the most influential in the fascist movement, it would be Patriot Front. For a bunch of reactionaries, they're pretty good at branding, combining traditional Americana with fascist symbolism. In every successful past fascist movement, that's been a key element. It takes on the flavor of whatever culture it boils up in. You've probably heard the quote, "When fascism comes to America, it'll be wrapped in the flag and carrying a cross." Case in point. Patriot Front is another group that punches above its weight in terms of membership. Best estimates put the number at just 200. But they accounted for 82% of all incidents in 2021 that involved the distribution of fascist, racist, or otherwise bigoted propaganda in the US. If you zoom out a bit, this is all kind of interesting. You've got your fraternity, your militias, your street thugs, and your propagandists. Speculation aside, the important thing to realize about American fascism is that it's not confined to this handful of explicitly fascist groups.
Yes.
It's become mainstream among the American right.
That's what's more important to me than anything else. The fact that like these guys are almost in agreement with these guys are in agreement with 98% of the values of the average Republican at this point, and they've become more and more mainstream. Like, sure, there's some who are not as rabid in their, offensive and outward hatred of all minorities and whatnot. But at the end of the day, there's so many motherfuckers. Like the average Republican, the reason why Trump gained so much prominence is because he spoke like the average Republican. He took the suppressor off, basically, and let it ride. He didn't say immigration and demographics are becoming a real problem for America. He said Mexicans are rapists and drug dealers, and some of them are very fine people. That's exactly what the average Republican thinks. That's exactly what the average Mexican Republican thinks, by the way, in Texas, okay? He just straight up was like, yeah, dude, these rapists are coming over the borders, man. And it's like, bro, your name is literally Juan Gonzalez. You're like a 8th generation Texas Mexican. What the are you saying? It's crazy, but it's true. Not Democracy Now. Shut up. It's just the first name that came in my mind. Okay, chill. I would never.
Here's an ex-military business owner back during peak COVID.
But it's not going to be peaceful much longer. Okay? And this isn't a threat. I'm not a criminal. I've never been a criminal. But I'm telling you that good citizens are going to turn into real concerned and revolutionary citizens real soon. And nobody else is going to say that. I'm probably the only person that has the balls to say what I'm saying right now. That we're building, we're organizing, and we'll work with law enforcement or without law enforcement. But you won't stop us when time comes because our families are starving. And if you don't hear the seriousness of my voice, I hope you open your ears and you absolutely listen to what I'm saying. Because this is a warning for what's coming. It's not going to be peaceful much longer. It's not going to be rah-rah. It's not going to be speeches. It's not going to be gathering outside saying a Pledge of Allegiance. It's not going to be waving flags. It's going to be real. When you've seen the things that I've seen, I went to war for this country. I've seen the ugliest, dirtiest part of humanity. I've been in combat, and I never want to go back again. But I'm telling you what, I will to save this country. If it has to be against our own citizens, it will happen. And there's a million people like me, and you won't stop us.
Sounds pretty bad. But this is exactly the type of person we saw at the Capitol riot.
I mean, dude, you guys are complaining, but he probably already ended it. You know what I mean? Like, let's be for real. That dude needs healthcare more than anything else, okay?
The fascist groups were there. At least 700 members of their organizations got arrested. But they were a drop in the bucket compared to what most people would call average conservatives. Only around 13% of those charged in the Capitol riots were formal members of militant groups like the Proud Boys, the Three Percenters, and the Oath Keepers. The remaining 87% were a mix of garden-variety Trump supporters and conservatives LARPing as revolutionaries. The overwhelming majority of people who stormed the Capitol were just average Republicans. And you can tell. They didn't look like the typical far-right extremists. They were typically older, with around 2/3 being over 35. They were much less likely to be unemployed. A full 14% of the attendees charged were business owners, and 30% were white-collar workers. These aren't normal far-right extremist demographics. These are just Republican constituency demographics. That's why fascists target the suburbs, as we mentioned earlier. The aggrieved white middle class is ripe for radicalization. The average American conservative...
Yeah, dude, the countryside surrounds the cities. Never forget. This revolution, this Maoist revolution in the United States of America will be a glorious struggle, okay, of HVAC business owners. Instead of a peasants' revolution, we're going to have a HVAC business owner Maoist revolution, okay? Petty bourgeois, dumb reactionary business owners.
Okay, why is this happening? Conservatives have always been reactionary, but what's changed in the last decade or so? Well, there are a few factors. We'll start with a culture war issue, the white genocide myth. The Great Replacement theory is a classic among fascists. It asserts that there is a plot, which really means they think it's a Jewish thing, that the white race and white culture, whatever that means, are disappearing because of immigration from majority non-white countries. This is the theory that motivated the Christchurch shooter Brenton Tarrant and the El Paso shooter Patrick Crusius, and it's both unfounded and blatantly fascist. You won't be surprised to learn that this theory has a historical trajectory that starts in World War II, runs through the European fascist movements, the American Nazi Party, and has now found a home among the majority of the Republican electorate.
Oh yeah.
Here's a clip of Tucker Carlson endorsing the theory on Fox, calling it by name, and likening it to eugenics.
Joe Biden just said it. To change the racial mix of the country. That's the reason, to reduce the political power of people whose ancestors lived here and dramatically increase the proportion of Americans newly arrived from the third world. And then Biden went further. He said that non-white DNA is the, quote, source of our strength. Imagine saying that. This is the language of eugenics. It's horrifying. But there's a reason Biden said it. In political terms, this policy is called the Great Replacement, the replacement of legacy Americans with more obedient people from faraway countries. They brag about it all the time, but if you dare to say it's happening, they will scream at you with maximum hysteria.
Notice that little trick that Tucker Carlson pulled right there when he said legacy Americans. It's one of my favorite Tucker Carlson tropes. He can't say Native Americans because obviously we all know what the that means. So he has to find a different word for it. Legacy Americans. He can't say white Americans, right? He can't say WASPs. So he means legacy Americans, those who deserve to be here.
And here you have Joe Biden confirming his motive on tape with a smile on his face.
This type of racist xenophobia isn't new. Every fascist project in history has needed to create a chosen people and a barbaric enemy to justify their anti-human politics. Even a cursory glance at any history book will make it clear where this trend comes from. But why does it start in the first place? Human beings can be awful, distrustful people, but just randomly deciding to build an exterminatory worldview out of their bigotry doesn't make much sense. Think back to that town hall video. What did the guy say was the spark for their aggression? Not being able to feed their families.
You guys should keep sending me
And
the
you know what?
Macklemore video.
That's a perfectly valid reason to be upset. The problem is the solution he and other fascists land on is to exterminate or deport anyone deemed to be detrimental to white people making money and keeping their privileged position. Or, in their eyes, prevent hardworking patriots from losing economic ground because their opportunities are being stolen by foreigners. The economic base of fascism has always been the petit bourgeois, or as I like to call them, the roofing class, small business owners, the guys who have a handful of contractors and patrons.
I like that. I say HVAC, but roofing works too.
$1,200 a month on an F-150 Raptor that's never been used for any kind of manual labor. But I digress. I really try my best to understand fascists because it's an interesting phenomenon. Socialism offers, in my opinion, a common sense solution to the ills of capitalism. Economic democracy. The people who do the work have a say in how the work is done, and profits can't be siphoned off by unelected corporate tyrants. Fascism, on the other hand, has to create this elaborate fantasy to justify why one particular group of people is destined to inherit the earth. And conveniently, it's the people in your country and the group you happen to fall into. It's the same gripe I have with Calvinists. They believe that all humans are predestined to go to either heaven or hell, and nothing we do can influence that destiny. I've never met a Calvinist who believes they're going to hell. If I try really hard to check my basic human decency at the door, I can see why fascist mythology could be appealing. It lets you off the hook. It justifies the worst cruelties because you are defending what is good and righteous from human animals who want to tear down a beautiful civilization. The problem is, the civilization fascists claim to be defending has never existed. It's a myth. There is no single white race. Just ask the Irish, or the Italians, or the Russians, or the Ukrainians, or the Jews, who have all had their white card revoked or granted at some point. There is no period in American history where everything was great for the white working class. Every worker in this country has always been at the mercy of the elite, but not the elite fascists assume are pulling the strings. It's not a shadowy cabal of woke Jews. It's just the people who own the means of production. They're not shy about it. People like Warren Buffett routinely admit there's a class war being waged, and that the capitalists want to make sure that they win it. The glorious fascist revolution that these self-proclaimed patriots want, it's not revolutionary at all. It's just turning back the clock to a time where these class antagonisms were less apparent, where the capitalist class still had complete control over society, but maybe black people had fewer rights. If that's your vision of utopia, you're a moron. You are risking decades in prison because you want to make sure the boot stays on your neck because you like the lies the boot spouts while it's stepping on you. The Republicans love fascists because it's an ideology that maintains the economic status quo. They don't like it when their useful idiots try to lynch them, so people have to go to jail for that. But on the whole, there's a reason the ruling class tolerates fascism and not socialism. Socialism is genuinely revolutionary, whereas fascism is just a cancerous offshoot of capitalism that can, in their mind, be used as a tool when needed.
And also uses a tool against your perceived enemies, of course, and never you. Nobody ever thinks about how fascist concepts or racist concepts ever impact you. This is why, I forget what the name of the book was, but there's a book specifically detailing how white supremacy kills white people. But I guess the most reductive, easiest way to explain the concept is basically the age-old adage now that has always found its way in American politics. The famous concept best illustrated by Ronald Reagan's spokesperson at the time, who was instrumental in the Southern Strategy, which is the idea Lee Atwater, who talked about how Republicans and right-wing reactionaries mask the white supremacist agenda with increasingly more mystified ways. Like, it's not direct in the same way as saying the N-word over and over again like you could in the 60s, but instead talking about welfare queens. Now, of course, the inevitable consequence of the welfare queen idea is that those who desperately need social safety nets, which, by the way, of course, are white people as well, no longer get it. Why don't they get it? Why is it cut off? Well, because at least black people have their social safety nets cut off, then we want to harm them. That's precisely the reason why everybody loves talking about South Side of Chicago. Everybody loves talking about Detroit. Everybody loves talking about purposely underfunded black neighborhoods, black communities that have been victim to redlining and a damn near century of segregation and other forms of white supremacist structural violence. And yet nobody understands that there are many suburbs and many parts of Pennsylvania that are predominantly white that are also victim to the same dire circumstances. The example I love using for that very same reason is West Virginia, an entire state full of white people that live in horrifyingly destitute conditions. And those motherfuckers love voting Republican over and over again. For every black urban underserved, underfinanced, and victimized community, there's a white equivalent. There's a white counterpart that also is not getting mentioned, that is also not getting seen. And a lot of those white people in those neighborhoods and in those communities are actually so motivated by the white supremacist attitudes that they channel and champion, and those attitudes that are reflected by their politicians that they want to elect, that they don't recognize that, in the words of Lyndon Big Dick Johnson, the white man is taking money directly out of their own pockets.
And this isn't the first time the ruling class has taken advantage of economic precarity. Once upon a time, a group of super wealthy capitalists hatched a scheme to try to convince a group of vulnerable Americans to launch an insurrection and overthrow the government, at which point the group of oligarchs would establish what amounted to a fascist dictatorship in the service of capital.
A business plot.
Sounds a bit like January 6th, doesn't it? This attempted coup was called the business plot, and it actually happened way back in 1933. The short version is that a retired general, one Smedley Butler, was approached by a would-be financier who offered him funding and 500,000 men to lead an insurrection to depose then-President FDR. Roosevelt's election and subsequent economic reforms had horrified conservative businessmen, who saw him as a socialist. So naturally, when given the choice between socialism and fascism, they overwhelmingly sided with fascism, telling Butler they hoped to install him as an all-powerful Secretary of General Affairs, while Roosevelt would assume a figurehead role. Unfortunately for the plotters, Butler ratted them out. In his later years, General Butler had come to support FDR and was a fairly outspoken critic of capitalism, referring to his past self as a high-class muscle man for Wall Street. The business plot failed, and it gives us a great example of how economic precarity can be weaponized to fascist ends. The capitalists understood that thousands of First World War veterans were disenchanted with the US, having not received their promised benefits, and they figured if they could just get a popular, willing leader to stoke the discontent into a fascist
Damn, bro. Sounds familiar, huh?
fervor, they'd have free reign of the country's economy, creating an unholy merger of capital and the state, a cornerstone of fascism. What we are seeing
Yeah. Well, you have another place that you can look to under dire financial circumstances, comprised almost entirely of disillusioned and angry World War I veterans that did actually end up taking control over the government. That country now is the #1 dick rider of Israel. Germany.
Today has the same hallmarks of every other period where fascism has grown in popularity. Economic insecurity, the formation of fascist paramilitaries, and a series of charismatic figures trying to tap into the rising tide of far-right populism for personal gain. While it's important to have empathy for people who are struggling economically and looking for answers, once someone chooses to become a fascist, they are a threat. But it's also important to realize that these people are by and large losers and cowards. They talk a big game, but they run away when faced with anti-fascist resistance. Instead of getting up on a soapbox like their idols, they target children with hate speech and lurk online. They wear ridiculous outfits complete with cardboard shields. And if we're being honest, most of these people don't really match the Ubermensch archetype. At the end of the day, they're pathetic reactionaries who whine about wokeness and weaponize culture and religion to spread a hateful message with no basis in reality. But that doesn't mean they're not dangerous. Never underestimate your enemy, especially when they've convinced themselves that they are the chosen ones and everybody else is subhuman.
So mentally ill.
So,
awesome.
Is the US headed for fascism? Yes and no. The US is a settler colonial imperialist project. It's primed for fascism by default. Any nation dependent on the exploitation of others is one bad quarter away from going full Mussolini. That being said, the economic conditions that allow for the growth of fascism also result in the growth of class consciousness, which gives socialism a chance to fight back. Under every single fascist regime in history, the socialists were the first to be targeted, because fascists know that socialism is a threat to capital, and that any truly egalitarian system has to get rid of the exploitative system that is capitalism. Fascists don't want revolutionary change. They want violent maintenance of the status quo, and they want to turn the violence of the empire, usually reserved for foreigners, inward, suppressing whatever groups they don't like. So yes, fascism is on the rise. So is socialism. And it's our job to make sure this time, fascists don't get their way, and that instead, we forge a path towards a brighter, more humane future.
My God, he read history and learned nothing. The reason fascists got support from the establishment was the socialists screaming about revolution, scaring the liberals into supporting the fascists. Thank you for your accurate read on how this worked. It's just liberals keep consistently siding with the fascists and becoming fascists. Why? Because the socialists scared them. Please tell me this is a top of the hour ad break debate and not something that you legitimately believe, because you are basically saying, oh no, I am going to be convinced into joining fascism. Please tell me you are joking, because I cannot comprehend how someone could turn around and be like, no, you don't understand. I got too scared that people were saying that the means of production should have a democratic organization surrounding it, and that was too terrifying for me. The socialists actually attempted revolution in Germany, man. Don't forget that if you tell the liberals you were taking their they are not just going to capitulate. Brother, I don't know how to have this conversation with you because it is 2024. You are basically running cover for those who literally aligned with the National Socialist Party. You are unironically doing Nazi apologia after the Holocaust. How am I supposed to look at you and think of you as anything but just a regular old fascist when what you are saying, even though you are utilizing liberal language to basically massage the narrative a little bit, is what amounts to someone who is defending the Nazi party? This is unimaginable. You are trying to say that the revolutionary momentum, which was objectively correct at the time and objectively better than the Nazi party's reign in 2024, this isn't 1935. It's not 1938. It's 2024. What the are you saying? You have the benefit of hindsight. Use it. I mean, when you show the Enabling Act in 1933, they're going to say it was because the liberals capitulated to the fascists because they didn't think they were going to be as scary as they actually were as a consequence of how scary the socialists were. Because for liberals, and this, by the way, basically reconfirms exactly what JT was talking about before, which is that liberals will always prefer the fake order demonstrated by fascism, because fascism is just a mechanism when capitalism decays. It is a way to reinstate order under capitalism while still maintaining the same structure, the same hierarchies that capitalism demands. When capitalism is failing, you have two ways out of it. Obviously, in that utter chaos, in that total chaos, in that barbarism, you can turn to order. Order in that circumstance, Mike, wait, what? You are ignoring history. You forget that the Nazis didn't had killed Jews yet. So it's the other way around. Wait, what? Why do chatters actually respond to retorts that I knew they were going to give and have addressed already 5 minutes after the fact? I knew that he was going to say something along these lines, which is why I said, you're not making this argument in 1935. You're not making this argument in 1933. You're not making this argument in 1938. You're making this argument in 2024, demonstrating that you did not learn from the lessons that you should have learned from in the rise to power for the Nazi party. How the is the lesson here that it was the socialist fault? It just doesn't make sense. It basically, once again, reconfirms a lot of people's suspicions, including Stalin, who, wasn't the best guy, but he definitely nailed this part, that liberals, cut a liberal and a fascist bleeds. Like, liberals are way more comfortable with fascism than they are with socialism, like actual socialism, not the fake populism demonstrated by the Nazi Party, which, of course, in its first act of violence, basically cut out all the socialists and trade unionists. Those were the people that were put in the concentration camps first. Many of them were Jews themselves, but they were put in those concentration camps on the boundaries of being socialist and trade unionists until they moved on directly to anyone and everyone suspected of being Jewish. I know that wasn't a good quote, but wasn't Stalin a fascist? What? A fascist? No, Stalin was not a fascist. He was authoritarian. He was brutal. Many miscalculations overall, but he was not a fascist. What the Stalin was the #1 fascist killer at the time, as a matter of fact. Fascism is an ideology. Dictatorships or authoritarian governance does not automatically make one a fascist. It doesn't make it good, but I think a lot of people personally think that any and every despot, any and every thin-skinned, power-hungry leader automatically is fascist. The liberals reacted supporting the Nazis before they started killing the Jews. Yes, that is fair, but if you push people by trying to take their stuff, they're going to resort to what they can find, and what they can find are always fascists. Brother, I don't think you have understood anything from the lessons you were supposed to learn from history. What good is reading about history if you look to the mistakes that people made in 1933 and then go, and we have to repeat it. We have to repeat those mistakes. I didn't learn anything from that, actually, which is odd because you are personally also saying that the fascists were bad and killed a ton of Jews. They killed a ton of other people too. Why are you trying to explain the reasoning behind making horrifyingly bad moves that inevitably make you a fascist? Stalin tried to form a pact with the West against the Nazis first, was rebuffed by the West, who also had pacts with the Nazis, appeasement, and instead bought time to turn an agrarian society into an industrial war machine that defeated the Nazis. Liberals. I know. Liberals always love talking about Molotov. I always fuck this name up. Ribbentrop. Did I say it right? And yet don't realize that appeasement is the identical thing. It is the same exact principle behind dumb Republicans turning around and saying that Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. It's like, okay, then why are you wearing the Confederate garb while you're saying that to me? Why are you currently wearing the Confederate garb while saying that to me right now, while defending the Confederacy, while saying that the Confederacy must exist and will thrive? Why are you telling me that Abraham Lincoln was the Republican? Why? It's so fucking stupid. Motherfuckers wearing the stars and bars being like, well, you know, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. We freed the slaves ourselves, which was bad and wrong, and I hate it. And the racial pecking order must continue. That's why I represent the stars and bars here, which Abraham Lincoln also defeated, which I will conveniently remind you was a Republican. Okay, liberals who are like 3 seconds removed from being fascist themselves, who are basically like, fascism is fine as long as we can still, you know, be legally gay, are turning around and being like, you know, well, the USSR actually aligned with the Nazis. It's like, okay, well, so do the liberals. So what the fuck are we talking about? So do the Western world. What the fuck do you mean? It's like, I think something that happened afterwards, after that alignment, is probably a little bit more significant. There are a metric ton of people who think the USSR is fascist. Yes, they're dumb Amerifat morons. I don't know how else to describe it other than that. Especially in the period of World War II, both the USSR and the United States of America, at least for that duration, when aligned with one another, were demonstrably not fascist and were actually, as a matter of fact, anti-fascist. Ridiculous. A ton of Americans also think Nancy Pelosi is a socialist. Maybe a smaller number, but still a significant number of Americans think Jeff Bezos is a socialist. You can't reason with some of these dumb. I can't deal with people's lack of interest in history and their false understanding of history over and over and over again every single day. People also believe, as a chatter correctly pointed out, that Biden is a communist.